next question is, I know that you do take inspiration, as you've mentioned, from the environmental humanities, scholars such as the late Deborah Bird Rose, Tom Van Duren. Can you help us understand how, in thinking with them, you think about the world, the material world, the more than human world, as being agentic? Because for many of us, this becomes a challenge. We assign human agency when we think of something as having agency. And we have a struggle to see that agency in a common world's paradigm or framework is agency that's enacted by materials, humans, and other beings in relationships. So I'm wondering if you can, probably my question was a bit confusing, but if you can talk about this idea of an agentic world and what does it mean to be in relationship with an agentic world?
That's such a good question, Kathleen. And I think, though, that one of the things that gets in the way of us thinking about an agentic world is the agentic child. And so we often get fixated on that. And I think we have to think about that concept because it's a relatively new concept to early childhood education when we think about the agentic child. And this concept comes from, you know, at the time, it was a new paradigm of childhood studies that was emerging from sociology. And this was in the 1990s. And if you think of the work of Alan Prout and Allison James, they were then, you know, really calling for us to understand children as social actors, shaping as well as shaped by their circumstances. So that was a really important concept. And then it kind of got picked up and worked with those of us that were working with feminist post-structuralism around gender. You know, all of a sudden, I just think back to Glenda McNaughton's work. And, you know, she gave this great example of the gendered child, that gendered children are not just these passive sponges that are soaking up images of what they see either at home or on TV or when they're read a storybook, that they actually are agentic and they can sometimes take up these messages, but also refuse them. And so I think we have to really recognize that the agentic child has been really a relatively new concept for early childhood. And then all of the research that the agentic child then sort of spurred, if you will. You could even think about, you know, voices of children, perspectives of children, the rights of the child. And so I think that this gets in the way oftentimes of thinking about the agentic world, because what we're talking about in the common worlds is that it's the idea that agency is relational, that it's collectively distributed, and that it's more than human. And so all of that work that came from the sociology of childhood and childhood studies wasn't talking about the more than human, not really, or it didn't get picked up in that way. So I think that's really important to think about. And I think that makes it problematic methodologically as well. So if we're thinking about agency in the agentic world, it's all too easy just to focus on a thing or an object rather than expanding the unit of analysis, if you will, that we've got to expand and think through relations. And so what are those tools that we have to even think about relations as distributed? You know, how do you go about even observing that, seeing that, noticing that? And I come back to early childhood of what often gets in the way. You know, if we think about the observational practices that educators are expected to do, it's usually about the child, finding out what's wrong with the child, and then fixing the child. So it's a tricky one, a tricky one.
I muted myself, sorry. So Mindy,
oh,
sorry, Veronica, were you going to say something?
I was going to say, 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 I was Are you going to follow up on Mindy's question?
Or do you want to add to it?
Well, I'll
Are you
follow
going to
up.
add to it, Veronica?
I mean, it comes back to the, the problem with stewardship, thinking of the child as the environmental steward of the future. That's, the child is the agent, always the agent, right? And the world, the nature in that discourse is this kind of passive inert thing that the child acts on as a protector, as a student, as a steward. There's no agency in the world there in the stewardship paradigm. But just to kind of pick up on what Mindy said there, I think, lots of theorists who are challenging humanism have brought our attention to the fact that nothing exists outside of relations. And that's why they should be the central unit of analysis in research, but we're also why we argue in common worlding pedagogies that they should be the central focus, of our pedagogies. So I've got this, big kind of thing about humanism and the legacy that we inherit, from a kind of an education system, well, a Western society and an education system that is really the child of humanism. The really good things about it are that it's interested in justice and in social change, humanism. Well, there's a branch of humanism that and sees education as a route towards making, the world more, making, better lives available for more people. Just like it's a distributive notion that with education you can redistribute, the good things of social life, and people can get a leg up, and it's a sort of a social equalizer. That's all fantastic, but the problem is that it never kind of goes beyond the sort of human society framework, and that's problematic. But another thing that's really problematic for me about humanism, and this brings us back to your question about agency, is that that the premise of humanism is that only humans, that humans have agency. We just have to tap into it and become empowered. That's often the language. And then we can choose, that's another big word that's related to humanist notions of agency. We can choose how to exercise that agency. It's really hardwired into Western ways of knowing, and it's always comes out in education. So, we're constantly telling children that they must choose, make a choice, because we're trying to encourage them to be more and more agentic, because we believe that inside of them, they are inherently agentic. They just have to kind of empower themselves and then act on it. And because that, humanism also stresses that humans alone are rational beings, and therefore we can think and we can exercise intentional agency. This is all the kind of framework that we have for agency. And when we start to think about the non-human world, and I think I saw this in some of the early pieces of work that were circulating in early childhood, where people were starting, like when Hillary released her book, forgotten what it's called now, but she was using Karen Barad's notion on interactive relations, and she was talking about children in sand pits and the sand, the agency in the relation between the child and sand. Thanks, Mindy. So, yeah, so where am I going with this? Yeah, when people started to grasp the idea that maybe not only humans had agency, I think one of the problems was we kind of naively still used a humanist kind of framework of agency, but we sort of put it onto the non-human. So the sand all of a sudden intrinsically had agency, and it acted on us. But actually that's not the point. It's kind of like missing the point. It's all missing the point, because it just sounds weird and anthropomorphic when you start talking about all these other things having agency and acting on us. It's the interaction, it's the relationship that is the locus that makes everything happen, including change. All changes happen in relations. They never happen with one individual deciding intentionally they're going to exercise agency to change things. None of us act alone, ever. And so all change comes from interaction, from relations. So when you think about agency, say in relation to children in the sandpit, I think the whole point isn't that that the water has agency in the sandpit, the sand has agency, but it's that there's this interaction going on between water particles, atmospheric pressure, sand, gravity, and maybe there are plastic spades that are moving through with certain physical properties that displace particles, and children's hands are pushing those, but it's also pushing back on them because of the the viscosity perhaps of that. And that's all that complex interaction, very physical, in a physics kind of sense, is what agency is. It's that interrelationship between things. I guess it's something that quantum physicists have been telling us for a long time, that it's not about particles, even at the smallest levels. It's not about the elements. It's not about atoms, or even smaller, the neutrons and the rest of the sort of elements of the atom. It's about the interactions between them. That's what makes stuff happen. So yeah, that's it. It's just really hard to make the shift from a humanist understanding of having agency and then exercising agency as an individual to this much more complex relational notion that has nothing to do with humanist thinking. It's very different to it, which is in its essence, more to do with physics than to do with anything else, actually. Relational physics, yeah.
And Kathleen, to go back to your point, what Affrica is noting here, it has been one of the problems in how common worlds pedagogies have been taken on, right? Like beginning to think, oh, like, let's just listen to the rock, let's just listen to the land. And yes, of course, we might be listening to rocks and to the land, but the rock and the land are not going to speak to us in a human way. So how do we ensure that this work is rigorous work, that is serious work, and it attends to to agency in the way that Affrica is talking about, rather than just transferring this human agency into, or an idea of human agency into materials and other beings. And one of the, I know that at the same time that I say this, I am not suggesting that is an easy thing to do. It is an extremely difficult thing to do in early childhood education. One, because, like Mindy says, we're always focusing on the child. The other one, because when we focus on something else, we'll just give it human agency. But I have been trying to think about politics rather than thinking about agency. Like when I work with raccoons, for example, it was a very raccoons and children relations. It was very useful for me to think about that raccoons also have a politics, which is maybe extremely different than the politics that we might have, right? So what is this politics? How do raccoons engage with the world? What are the kinds of responses that raccoons might provide, the movements? So I find that sometimes I need to get away from the idea of thinking of agency, particularly when working with educators, to be able to come to some kind of engagement with the more than human.
So I think you introduced to us a lot of ideas to really, and it even challenges us to think about how we even use that word agency and how we move from human-centric to understanding agency in relationships, what means that we can make space for politics, we can make space for ethics. But in terms of in our pedagogy and our way of thinking, is it also helping us think about how materials and humans come together that make certain things possible, but not other things possible? So I'm thinking about when we go into the sand, certain things with groups of children are possible and not possible. Clay makes possible certain ways of representing the world that paint doesn't. Is that also, sorry, Affrica?
Well, I think what you're describing, I think of that as affordance. That certain, there's a certain, materials or circumstances afford particular kind of activities and outcomes. And I think affordance is part of the mix in relational agency, or agency thought of as relational, because clearly not everything is possible in every agentic, interaction. Only some things can come out of certain things, and it's not always good. Like changes always happen in the interaction, not always great. And there's limits. Clearly there's limits, and those limits are to some extent kind of defined by the affordances of what's in the mix, which is, I think, what you're talking about. The affordances of sand are very different to the affordances of clay. So in the interactions, the agentic kind of outcomes of those interactions are sort of limited by those affordances. Is that what you mean? Is that what you're getting at?
Yeah. Just trying to help us sort of think as we take your ideas, how do we walk with them in the classroom? So for example, Mindy, you talk about language and how that when we can use language in particular ways, and I just have to grab my piece of paper here, but you talk about linguistic imperialism as a human.
Yes, look, so thinking with Robin Wall Kimmerer, which is where I read about linguistic imperialism, but it's a whole other, genre in itself. I didn't even realize that. But reading Robin Wall Kimmerer's work and reading how she describes some of these relations that not only she has with the world, but just how the world is all full of relations, that's taught me a lot. So again, it's about learning about these ideas in a radically different way. Like, I don't open up a textbook that then tells me this is what you do first, this is what you do second. I've been learning by reading, how does Donna Haraway write? What does she pick up on? She does all of this tracing, this back and forth, and she's not saying this is what I do, she's doing it. And so I look at and I read Robin Wall Kimmerer's work, and she's doing it. And so she's taught me about language, and that there's this idea of linguistic imperialism. So in the English language, do you know that the English language is 70% of the words are nouns, which means a noun is about a thing or an object. So see, our language gets in the way of even writing. How can you even think with relations if your whole mindset is about nouns rather than verbs and gerunds? And a gerund is an ing ending word. And so, so what I've done is with the writing, and again, thinking with Tom Van Doren and Deborah Bird Rose and this idea of lively stories, I've paid attention to how they write about relations. Deborah Bird Rose taught me, and it was in one of her blog posts that it was first, that I first saw it, when she was writing about the flying foxes. And it wasn't about the flying foxes, it was about these relations that the flying fox has with weather, and has with, or what weather activates with these gum trees as well, of how the gum trees open up and the nectar that's available. So it's about those relations. So how do I begin to pay it, even recognize that there are these relations in the world? Well, of course there are, but we don't pay attention to them because we pay attention to things and objects rather than the relations. And then how do you write them? And, you know, this piece that I just wrote with Catherine Ham about lively emu stories, I've forgotten what the title of it is, but one of the reviewers made this great comment that, and she was asking us, and she said, you know, not for this paper, but for something else, you need to write about how you're creating these lively stories because, and she was talking about from a teacher education perspective, most of her students get lost because they just want to tell about or write about. And in our lively stories, what we've done, and we've crafted and recrafted these stories, thinking about the animacy of the world. And how do you then write this when our English language is full of nouns? So it's even with the writing, how do you write in a way that is more performative? So it's doing the relations and doing this distributed sort of agency. So I don't think I'm articulating this well, but for me, it's with this storytelling and how we write, but we also need to learn how to listen very differently. So even though I might tell a different story, there's no guarantee that you're going to listen, because I think we need to learn how to listen. So it's not only learning how to tell different kinds of stories, but it's also about learning how to listen differently. But in those tellings, you know, it's about recrafting them. And I guess it's, for me, it's the arts that's helping me to do that. And so again, it's moving outside of early childhood, because early childhood isn't teaching me how to bring this alive for a wider audience, I guess. So I don't know if that answered your question about linguistic imperialism.
I think it does, because you helped, for me, what I was trying to get, because I come from teacher education, is, you know, how do we walk into a classroom and not be noun focused, whether it's focused on children or focused on this, but rather focus on the in-between, the relationships that are happening in between. And it's really hard when we don't have the language. When we don't have the way, because we're not focused on that. We're focused on this and describing that thing. And how do we talk about the in-between?
That's right. And I think it's related to, I wrote down a note. It's something that Veronica said earlier. And she said, you know, she wasn't trying to put up this binary, but we do think in binaries often. Our whole world is structured around that. But I think there's something about this, you know, trying to find an ideal answer that gets in the way as well. Like, this is like big stuff we're trying to challenge. And I wonder if some of it has to do with a different sort of stance to the world that we need, you know, and that means that's going to require a whole different way of being with the world, and maybe not always knowing about the world, and learning how to be much more comfortable and not always rushing in to try to fix. Like, I think it's this whole set of, it's a different way of being, a different attitude, a different stance, if you will. I don't want to use the word disposition because that's too psychological for me, but it's about an opening up and being vulnerable and taking risks. Like, I think that's all related. And I think that oftentimes, what, taking us back to the agency question, I think early childhood, we are just saturated with practices that get in the way. And yeah, and Affrica said something, her example about the choice, and that gets in the way too. You know, early childhood, think about a choice, you know, free choice, you know, and we take such pride of that in early childhood education in the West. And I think back to Joe Tobin's amazing work with the preschool in 3 cultures, where you can really see that at play when you look at the American example and all of the ways that teachers get children to have that choice and to have their perspective and to have their voice. You know, it's just this reinforcement over and over, but we just don't recognize it.
Mm-hmm.
I could go on and on about that, but I won't.
But I think it's really helpful for us because not to use the word disposition, but it is a helpful word to think about how we go into a classroom with a disposition to pay attention to the singular. And what does it mean when we think with the Common Worlds Collective to go and pay attention to the relationships between the beings in that classroom? And that's a huge shift for us as educators, because often, as you said at the very beginning, I think, Affrica, we want to go in and we see the child and fix that child, rather than paying attention to the context in which that child finds themselves, the relationships that are happening, what sustains particular ways of being in the world, and what possibly could disrupt, which are very different questions to what's the problem.
Well, and that's and one of the things that this will be it, but I've learned from Veronica. See, I think we've been asking the wrong questions in early childhood. And so what I've learned from Veronica is the way that Veronica asks a whole different set of questions. And so I think that's also been really instructive for me. We have to ask different kinds of questions.
I think so.